it's not enough to be a free spell in Magic the Gathering anymore. Heck, even in the Eternal formats, it's just not good enough to cost 0 or be alternatively cast with something like exiling a card from your hand with evoke spells. You need to have multiple purposes. And this is a rising trend that I wanted to address in this video, and how recent sets like Lord of the Rings, Tales of Middle-earth, and heck, even Modern Horizons are really shifting play design towards a slippery slope of value that I think is ultimately something that we can't escape from. And I'll let you, after this video, decide whether or not this is going to be good for Eternal formats like Modern or Legacy. I get it, Modern isn't an Eternal format, but just bear with me here for the sake of argument. And whether or not this is really going to be the future of Magic, and is there a way to really rein it in? Now, this discussion stems from a tweet from Saffron Olive, the one that he recently posted about. We realized that he's never really seen a Modern player actually cast Lorien Revealed. And for many of you that have played more grindy games, you've probably seen the card cast for 3. I've casted for 3 myself, but really the island cycling is one of the key synergies of this. And there are other ways that you can abuse this, just being blue and all that stuff, but that's for a later part in the video. For now, the island cycling affects the Modern metagame, where if we see a older version of Crashing Footfalls from March 31st, we see that the deck is playing 24 lands and no Lorien because the Lord of the Rings set isn't out just yet. But with those 24 lands, if we take a more recent deck list from September 2nd, we see that the land count is a lot lower. With 4 Lorien Revealed available, we see that the card essentially acts as a land drop, thinning out the deck, providing more spells, and heck, even in a grindy game, drawing 3. But as I mentioned, there are more purposes, but we're going to touch on that for a future argument and part of the video. But Lorien Revealed showing that it has multiple purposes, thinning out the deck, allowing you to play less lands, and arguably making the deck more budget, because if you have to play less shock lands or less lands in general, lands are pretty expensive part of Magic in general, and of course the fetch lands are still there, but heck, it's actually a pretty positive thing when you think about it like that. But even in Pauper being common in the Dimir control decks, you see it have multiple purposes, where it not only is able to act as a fetch land in a way and tutor up something like Contaminated Aquafire as an island swamp, so it searches up an island, but the swamp part of it allows you to cast Snuff Out, so that's a great way to enable that. But in the Dimir Terror deck, it acts as an instant sorcery in the graveyard for something like Tolarian Terror. So, drawing 3 on the top end, searching for Contaminated Aquafire, but also enabling your threats. The card does it all. I think that's what's scary about recent card design. You can't just have all these cards doing everything. I don't think you can. And I think that's the slippery slope that we're going down. Now, I think there are really egregious examples of this in history. I want to go through these, especially in Modern. I am a Modern focused channel, so that's where I'm going to take this discussion. And we see this from the GAC. Hogak Summer. Hogak being black and green. The deck itself is a very hypo aggro. There's been combo routes for it, and it could be a creature beatdown, but it's a graveyard strategy. And there are obviously a lot of very good anti-graveyard spells. The problem that arisen with Hogak itself was that it was so fast that some of these graveyard hate spells just couldn't get out enough, or they provided too much of a negative for your opponent. But if they could get it out, because Hogak is green, not only did it serve as the purpose of a threat and the namesake of the deck, but it could also pitch to Force of Vigor to delete your opponent's answers, to exile the 2 force Leyline of the Voids, I should say, or the resting pieces that your opponent had. If they had multiple options, Force of Vigor allowed you to destroy up to 2 target artifacts or enchantments, and Hogak provide that multi-purpose. A more common one that we see nowadays actually is in Kahira the Orphan Guard. Now, this is even before the companion errata, where we don't see it in this card version here, but you now have to pay 3 to put it in your hand, but before you could just put it into your hand and then cast it from your hand for 3. But this allows an extra copy of a card to pitch to something like Endurance. So again, we see another version of a card that's prolific in the Modern metagame, but acts as a multi-purpose function. It acts as a free card, one that's value in your sideboard, essentially in your companion zone, comes down as a 3/2 that can buff your creatures, but acts as a pitchable source as well. A lot of times your opponent will just put Kahira into their hand if they have nothing else to do, and then hold up that Endurance, hold up that Solitude, and that extra last card that they have in their hand, you can probably guess what it is if they do that. So again, the multiple factors that these cards have to play is kind of this card design that I think is intentional at this point. If it wasn't so before, testing has to understand that, R&D itself has to understand that with these Modern Horizon sets come on, they know what they're doing with these sets. They know when a certain card becomes a certain color that it becomes pitchable, it becomes exilable with the evoke elementals, it becomes a multi-purpose function for other cards that are powerful before it, enabling other strategies and essentially locking you into certain powerful cards that essentially can't be outlasted unless you print more powerful versions of them. And this is a rising trend that we see where free spells are no longer enough anymore. The spells themselves that are free, such as Endurance, are fine, they're throughout the format, but if you want to beat them or work alongside them, now you need to have multiple purposes. You need to do it all, as I've highlighted here. And with free spells, we've seen them all throughout Magic's history. Of course, Black Lotus being one of the most, I guess, the most famous Magic card of all time, maybe outside of the One Ring at this point, but Black Lotus being in contention for one of the most powerful Magic cards outside of Ancestral Recall, being 0 and giving you 3 mana. Extreme levels of value. We've seen this kind of replicated in a way where spells cost 0 or have alternative effects in something like Mindbreak Trap, where you have to meet a certain condition for this card to be 0. Heck, in Legacy, the fact that this is blue, it pitches to Force of Will, so that's a whole other game in itself, but it still costs 0 if a condition is met. Additionally, with something like Affinity, if you have enough artifacts, then, well, you could have a 4/4 for free. And Frogmite, you could have a 2/2 for free if you have enough artifacts. We see the free spell motif evolve throughout Magic's history. And then we see that kind of culminate in a card and a mechanic that I've mentioned before, more so a mechanic at this point, in the companion mechanic. Loros of the Dream Den, before we had the companion errata of 3, it's still a very valuable mechanic to have, and this is why Loros is banned in Modern and many other formats at this point. But Loros of the Dream Den provides this multi-purpose value. Not only is it a 3/2, it can pitch to Solitude, it can pitch to Grief. Not that it was commonly used in those, because obviously each of your permanents had to be 2 or less, but there are instances where this happened. And having lifelink as an option against burn, each of your turns you get the reanimation effect. There's so many minute niche parts of cards like this that have certain effects that now you have to test for. You have to understand that these cards have such a wide grip on these Eternal formats that this is the slippery slope of design. We've gone from Black Lotus, which of course is banned in many formats, hasn't been reprinted, part of the reserve list, but evolved into mechanics like Affinity or Mindbreak Trap that has alternative effects, to now cards just having keyword soup all over them. You need to be able to do everything to make it in these stronger formats. And with Lorien revealed, I think this has become, or the Land Cyclers in general, has truly become that face value effect, where it's 5 mana to draw 3 cards, but it can island cycle and it's blue. It has a tutor effect, a draw effect, and is very pitchable. As I was mentioning, I would talk about some of the alternative routes that this card can take, where Lorien Revealed is pitchable to Force of Negation. So in the Crashing Footfalls deck, of course it's a natural include. You thin out your deck of more lands, you play more spells, you have a better late game ability, and Force of Negation is then more usable. You have a land in your hand and a card that can also pitch to Force. You have a land in your hand and a card that can pitch to Subtlety. This card is absolutely so powerful. The fact that it's common is crazy to me, but I understand that it shouldn't be banned. It's just that it's a very slippery slope of design. As I've said for the 3rd or 4th time, Magic cards are going down a crazy path of value, of multi-purpose, of keyword soup. And we've seen this in many cards come up, people talking about how much text should actually be fit within these rectangles. And of course, we may not get within the realms of something like Yu-Gi-Oh, but what do we do now with this information? What do we think about as cards come out? Do we look for cards with as much text as possible? Are we looking for as many abilities as possible? And I think it's a mix of both, actually, because it's no longer about creatures having trample, death touch, hexproof. Like, it's not just about threats doing all that. Sometimes it's the subtle bits in between. Lorien Revealed, we see that draw 3 cards, being blue and tutoring for lands is just enough. That's not necessarily keyword soup. A lot of the text on the card is honestly just Oracle text. It's not even part of the rules of the card, or sorry, part of the casting part of the card necessarily, just a little bit of reminder text. And I think that's the interesting part. Card design has become so complicated. It's so hard to evaluate certain cards unless you just put them out in the field and start casting them, start pitching them, start using them for their alternative modalities. Now, we see this concept of value happen in other aspects of Magic. In Pro Tour Guilds of Ravnica, Luis Scott Vargas played a Game 5 match that he ultimately lost to Mulligans. And I think Magic understands, R&D understands that you want players to have onus in their game. You want them to have the ability to make as many decisions as possible. And that's where we've seen with Lorien Revealed, where you can draw cards, pitch it, or tutor with it. With this Pro Tour Guilds of Ravnica thing that happened with the mulliganing effect, it led to a very anticlimactic end to the game. So many people were watching this live on Twitch that it was crazy that a Pro Tour ended thanks to mulligans, and it didn't even happen due to skill and gameplay. And this led to the creation of the London Mulligan, where we used to have the Paris Mulligan or the Vancouver Mulligan, but now we have the London Mulligan that allows you to see 7 cards and then put some cards away. It gives players the onus, as much information as possible and as much ability as possible to make the correct decisions. It gives the power back to the player. And I think that is one positive part about this type of design. It's important to give players these decisions and this power. The problem is that if every card out there does this, doesn't this just become a keyword soup of cards just doing anything and everything? Where we used to have 1 mana red 2/1s that dealt damage to you, or had to attack every turn or whatever, but now we just have Ragavan that comes in, that can dash, that can make a treasure ramp you, steal your opponent's cards that do so much. Is value and giving power to the player going too far? And I think about this with Modern Horizons 3 around the corner. Of course, we're going to see a lot of reprints, a lot of cards returning to the set itself, but we're going to see a lot of net new cards, a lot of net new mechanics, and another way to give Modern, Legacy, Vintage, Commander more power to the player. And I think that's what I'm scared of. All this value might just become a problem, and it already has, but it might become harder to parse. Lorien Revealed wasn't necessarily on many people's eyes. It was interesting. A lot of people were really sure that these cards were powerful. They cycled away, they gave you tutor effects, but I don't think people really predicted the true ubiquity and the power that these cards provided in decks all throughout. And that's what I ask you today. Are we going down a slippery slope of value? Is there too much text on cards these days, or too many abilities on cards? How do we scale this back? I'm not sure. I just think it's a rising trend, and it's something concerning. And I'm not a card designer. I'm not a gameplay designer at all. I'm simply a patron of the game, and I'm a client of its mechanics. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. And as we get through all of these games that we play, as we come up to the Modern Horizons 3 fiasco that we're going to get next summer, happy spell slinging.